Welcome back, dear friends, to another compelling tale that's sure to stir your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat. Today, we dive into the life of a man who's done everything he can to care for his children, even when the world seemed to turn its back on him. Imagine the sacrifices, the quiet struggles, and the moments of desperation that no one ever sees, until, one day, everything changes in the blink of an eye. What would you do if your darkest secret was exposed in the most humiliating way possible? Johnny Miller awoke to the harsh buzz of his alarm clock, the weight of another long day already pressing on him. His job as a dishwasher at Campbell's Diner was grueling, but it was the only way to keep his kids fed, or at least, keep them from going hungry. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Sarah and Tommy, who slept soundly in the next room. Before leaving, he paused at their door, taking a moment to watch them sleep, his heart heavy with the promise he silently made to them every morning. He would find a way to give them a better life. At the diner, the familiar stench of grease and dish soap greeted him like an old adversary. Johnny plunged his hands into the hot, soapy water, feeling the sting of the blisters and calluses that never quite healed. The work was endless, a never-ending cycle of dirty dishes that seemed to multiply every time he thought he was catching up. But today, like every other day, Johnny kept a keen eye on the uneaten food left by the customers. It was a simple plan: take what he could, bring it home, and feed his kids. No one needed to know. As the lunch rush died down and the diner began to empty, Johnny discreetly slipped a few fries, a piece of steak, and some bread into a paper bag. He had become skilled at this quiet, desperate act. But today, he felt someone's eyes on him. He turned to see Mary, the waitress, watching him with a look of sorrow and understanding. Without a word, she added a fresh roll to the bag and gave him a small, knowing nod, which Johnny returned with a grateful smile. Unbeknownst to him, Mr. Campbell had also been watching, his sharp eyes narrowing as he observed Johnny's actions. A cold shiver ran down Johnny's spine, but he shook it off. All he wanted was to get home. When Johnny finally made it back to the small, worn-out house, Sarah and Tommy greeted him with eager hugs. He laid out the leftovers on the table as if it were a feast, but Sarah, always perceptive, noticed the exhaustion in her father's eyes. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her small hand gripping his. Johnny forced a smile, burying his worries deep down, and reassured her that everything was fine. But as the kids ate, the gnawing sense that something was about to change lingered in his mind. Johnny arrived at the diner the next morning, his nerves already frayed. The unease from the day before hadn't left him, but he pushed it aside. There was work to do. The lunch rush hit hard and fast, with a clatter of dishes and the hum of conversations filling the air. Johnny kept his head down, focusing on the endless stream of dirty plates. But as the afternoon wore on, something felt off. When the rush finally slowed, Mr. Campbell's voice cut through the din. "Miller," he barked, his tone sharp enough to make the other workers stop in their tracks. Johnny looked up, dread curling in his stomach. Mr. Campbell stood at the end of the kitchen, arms crossed, his expression a mask of cold disapproval. The other staff exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension. "Care to explain this?" Mr. Campbell held up the paper bag, now crumpled and empty. Johnny's heart sank. He hadn't realized that Mr. Campbell had found it. I was just trying to," Johnny began, but Mr. Campbell cut him off, his voice rising with anger. "Stealing from my diner to feed your brats. Is that it?" Mr. Campbell's words were laced with venom, and a few of the employees gasped at the harshness of the accusation. Johnny's face flushed with humiliation as everyone in the kitchen turned to stare. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. Mary stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "He wasn't stealing, Mr. Campbell. He's just trying to feed his kids. You know how tough things are for him." But Mr. Campbell's glare silenced her, and she stepped back, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think this is some kind of charity? You think you can just take what you want?" Mr. Campbell's voice boomed through the kitchen, his anger palpable. Johnny stood there, feeling smaller than ever, the weight of his situation crushing down on him. He could see the pity in the eyes of his co-workers, but it did nothing to ease the sting of Mr. Campbell's words. The silence that followed was heavy, and Johnny knew he couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how humiliating the situation. With his pride shattered, he lowered his head and muttered, "It won't happen again, sir." Mr. Campbell sneered, his lips curling in satisfaction. "See that it doesn't. Next time, you're out." He turned and walked away, leaving Johnny standing there, his face burning with shame. The other employees slowly returned to their tasks, the buzz of whispered conversations filling the air as they tried to process what had just happened. As Johnny returned to his work, the humiliation still fresh, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. And as the day dragged on, that sense of dread gnawed at him, reminding him that his quiet life of survival had just been shattered. The next few days at the diner were a blur of forced smiles and awkward silences. Word of Johnny's public dressing down had spread quickly, and everywhere he went, he felt the weight of people's stares. Conversations hushed when he passed by, and even the regulars who had always been friendly now seemed to avoid eye contact. Johnny's shame clung to him like a shadow, making each shift at the diner feel longer than the last. In the small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, it didn't take long for the story to reach every corner. Different versions of the incident were shared over cups of coffee and across fences, each one more embellished than the last. Some people pitied Johnny, seeing him as a victim of hard times. Others, less kind, whispered that maybe Mr. Campbell had been right to put him in his place. Johnny felt the eyes on him as he walked through town, and it took every ounce of strength to keep his head up. At home, he tried to shield Sarah and Tommy from the gossip, but even they could sense something was wrong. Sarah, sharp and intuitive as ever, caught on quickly. "Dad, why are people talking about us?" she asked one evening, her voice laced with worry. Johnny forced a smile, brushing off her concern with a vague reassurance that everything was fine. But inside, the pressure was building. One evening after his shift, Mary found Johnny sitting alone in the alley behind the diner, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She sat down beside him, offering him a cigarette she had tucked behind her ear. He took it gratefully, lighting it and inhaling deeply, the smoke calming his frayed nerves. "It's not fair what he did to you," Mary said quietly, her voice tinged with anger. "You were just trying to take care of your kids." Johnny exhaled, the smoke curling into the cool night air. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "I still need this job. I can't afford to make things worse." Mary hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Johnny, I've been thinking. Campbell isn't as clean as he wants everyone to think. There are things I've noticed, things that don't add up." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Maybe there's a way out of this mess. But it's risky." Johnny turned to look at her, a flicker of interest sparking in his tired eyes. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low. Mary glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned in closer. "If we can prove that he's been up to no good, it might be enough to get him off our backs. Maybe even shut him down." Her eyes searched his, looking for any sign of agreement. Johnny felt a surge of uncertainty. Could they really take on Mr. Campbell, the man who held their livelihoods in his hands? The thought was terrifying, but the alternative, continuing to live under Campbell's thumb, was unbearable. As they sat in the darkness, the first seeds of a plan began to take root in Johnny's mind. It was dangerous, but what choice did he have? For his kids, he would do anything. The following days brought a sense of determination that Johnny hadn't felt in a long time. Every moment he wasn't working, he was quietly observing, taking mental notes of the little things Mary had pointed out. The diner seemed the same on the surface. Customers came and went, orders were filled, and dishes piled up, but Johnny now saw everything with new eyes. There was a game being played beneath the surface, and he was starting to understand the rules. Mary became his confidant, and they met in secret whenever they could, piecing together the puzzle of Mr. Campbell's shady dealings. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the diner was not just a place for food. It was a front for something much bigger. Missing invoices, suspicious deliveries at odd hours, and whispered conversations between Campbell and men in expensive suits. They all pointed to something rotten at the core of Campbell's diner. Despite the mounting tension, Johnny found a strange comfort in the conspiracy he was now a part of. It gave him a sense of purpose, a goal beyond just making it through another day. But with that purpose came risk, and every step they took brought them closer to a line that, once crossed, there would be no turning back. At home, Johnny tried to keep his newfound resolve hidden from Sarah and Tommy. But Sarah, perceptive as ever, noticed the change in her father. She watched him closely, sensing that something was different. One evening, after dinner, she sat beside him as he reviewed a stack of old receipts he had brought home from the diner. "Dad," she asked softly, "what's going on? You seem different." Johnny looked up, startled by the directness of her question. He hesitated, unsure how much to tell her, but seeing the worry in her eyes, he decided to offer her a small part of the truth. "I'm just trying to make things better for us, Sarah. I know it's been hard, but I'm working on something that might change things. You just have to trust me, okay?" Sarah nodded slowly, though the uncertainty remained in her gaze. "I do trust you, Dad. I want you to be okay too." Her words hit Johnny harder than he expected, and he reached out to pull her into a hug. "I'll be okay, sweetheart. I promise." But as he held her, the weight of what he was about to do settled heavily on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Tommy remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil swirling around him. For him, the world was still full of adventures waiting to be had. He would often chatter excitedly about his day, filling the small house with the sound of his laughter. But even his innocence couldn't shield him from the subtle changes around him. He started to notice how quiet his father became when he thought no one was looking, and how Mary's visits seemed more serious, their conversations hushed and urgent. As the plan began to take shape, Johnny and Mary knew they were playing a dangerous game. But the thought of exposing Mr. Campbell and ending his reign over their lives fueled them both. Johnny's hesitation began to fade, replaced by a steely resolve. He would do whatever it took to protect his children and reclaim his dignity. And so, they continued to gather evidence, step by step, inching closer to the truth that could bring Mr. Campbell down. But with every discovery, the stakes grew higher, and Johnny knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to make their move. The more Johnny and Mary dug, the clearer it became that they were onto something big. Each day brought new pieces of the puzzle, but with every revelation, the risks grew. They had to be careful, making sure that their quiet investigation didn't catch Mr. Campbell's attention. Yet, the tension was building, and Johnny could feel it in the air, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. One night, after closing, Mary slipped Johnny a folder filled with documents she had managed to swipe from Campbell's office. "I found these in a drawer he keeps locked," she whispered, her eyes wide with the thrill of discovery. "I think this is it, Johnny. This could be what we need." Johnny opened the folder, his heart pounding as he scanned the papers. They were financial records, transactions that didn't add up, money flowing to and from accounts that didn't seem to have any legitimate purpose. One document, in particular, caught his eye, a receipt for a large cash transfer, marked with a code he didn't recognize. It was clear now. Campbell was involved in something illegal, something that could ruin him if it ever came to light. But with the discovery came a new problem. They couldn't just hand these over to the authorities without risking exposure themselves. They needed a plan, a way to ensure that this evidence would be taken seriously without putting their lives in danger. As they sat in the dim light of the diner's break room, going over the documents, Johnny felt a surge of anxiety. If we go to the cops with this, we have to make sure they believe us. Campbell has connections, money. He could make this disappear before we even get a chance to explain. Mary nodded, her expression grim. We need a way to protect ourselves. Maybe we send it anonymously? Or we could find someone in the media. Someone who would take this and run with it. The idea hung between them, heavy with implications. Johnny knew it was risky, but what choice did they have? If they didn't act soon, Campbell might catch on, and then they would lose everything. At home, the tension weighed on Johnny, and he struggled to keep his worries from Sarah and Tommy. Sarah, ever watchful, noticed how distracted her father had become, how his mind seemed to be elsewhere even when he was with them. She tried to engage him in conversation, to draw him out of whatever was troubling him, but Johnny remained distant, lost in thoughts of what they were about to do. One evening, Sarah found him sitting alone at the kitchen table, the documents spread out before him. "Dad, you're scaring me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "What's going on? You're not in trouble, are you?" Johnny looked up, the weight of his situation reflected in his tired eyes. He reached out to take her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not in trouble, sweetheart, but I'm trying to fix something that's really important. I just need you to trust me, okay?" Sarah searched his face, sensing the gravity of his words. She nodded slowly, though her worry was far from eased. "I do trust you, Dad. Just, please be careful." Johnny promised he would, but as the days passed and their plan began to take shape, he knew that careful might not be enough. They were playing with fire, and if they weren't careful, they could all get burned. The breaking point came when Mr. Campbell's suspicion finally got the better of him. He had noticed things, small discrepancies, missing papers, the way Johnny and Mary seemed more secretive than usual. And he wasn't a man to let things slide. Campbell began watching them more closely, his presence becoming an oppressive shadow over their every move. Johnny and Mary knew they were running out of time. The evidence was there, but now they needed to act. And as they prepared to make their next move, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down around them. Johnny couldn't sleep. The weight of what they were about to do pressed on him like a lead blanket. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with every possible outcome, every scenario where things went wrong. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and it was time to act. The next day, Johnny and Mary met in the alley behind the diner, their usual spot for secret meetings. The tension between them was palpable as they went over the final details of their plan. They would hand over the documents to a trusted journalist, someone who had no ties to the town and couldn't be influenced by Campbell's reach. It was their best shot at exposing the truth without putting themselves directly in the line of fire. As they prepared to leave, a sudden noise made them both jump. Mr. Campbell appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Johnny's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to come up with an excuse, but Campbell's cold stare told him it was too late. "You two have been acting strange lately," Campbell continued, taking a step closer. "What are you hiding?" Mary tried to play it off, but her voice wavered. "Nothing, Mr. Campbell. We were just talking." But Campbell wasn't buying it. He looked between them, his gaze settling on the folder Johnny was holding. "Hand that over," he ordered, his voice hard. Johnny hesitated, but he knew there was no point in resisting. Slowly, he handed the folder to Campbell, who snatched it from his hands and began flipping through the pages. As he read, his expression darkened, and Johnny could see the fury building in his eyes. "So this is what you've been up to," Campbell spat, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can just steal from me and get away with it?" Johnny stood his ground, his fear giving way to a steely resolve. "We didn't steal anything. We're just trying to stop you from ruining more lives." Campbell's eyes blazed with anger, and for a moment, Johnny thought the man might actually strike him. But instead, Campbell's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think anyone's going to believe you? You're nothing. Less than nothing. If you go to the cops with this, I'll make sure you and your kids are out on the street. You'll never work in this town again." The threat hung in the air like a noose around Johnny's neck. He could see the fear in Mary's eyes, the same fear that was clawing at his insides. But he couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close. "Do what you have to do," Johnny said, his voice steady despite the terror gripping him. "But we're going to the authorities with this. We're not going to let you get away with it." Campbell sneered, shoving the folder back into Johnny's hands. "Then you'd better be ready for the consequences," he hissed before turning on his heel and storming away. Johnny and Mary stood there in stunned silence, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. They had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The only thing left to do now was to see it through to the end. As they made their way to the journalist's office later that evening, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. They handed over the documents, explaining everything in detail, but even as they did, the nagging fear remained. Campbell was powerful, and if he followed through on his threats, they could lose everything. But for the sake of his children, Johnny knew he had to see this through, no matter the cost. The days following their meeting with the journalist were a blur of anxiety and uncertainty. Johnny and Mary knew that the story could break at any moment, and with it, the fragile peace they had managed to maintain. Every time the phone rang, Johnny's heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was the call that would change everything. Finally, the day came. The headline was splashed across the front page of the local newspaper. "Local businessman accused of financial fraud and exploitation." The article detailed Campbell's shady dealings, the missing money, and the illegal operations hidden behind the diner's facade. It was a damning expose, one that left little room for doubt about Campbell's guilt. The reaction in the town was immediate. People were shocked, some even outraged, that a man they had respected, or at least tolerated, had been involved in such corruption. Customers stopped coming to the diner, and the few who did were there out of curiosity, to see the man who had fooled them all. The once bustling diner was now a ghost town, its emptiness a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted outside its doors. Campbell, desperate to control the damage, tried to use his connections to discredit the story. He called in favors, leaned on old friends, and even threatened legal action against the newspaper. But the evidence was too strong, the details too precise. The journalists had done their homework, and there was no escaping the truth. Johnny felt a mix of relief and fear as the fallout began. The town's sympathy, once scarce, now started to shift in his favor. People who had once whispered behind his back now approached him with words of support, some even apologizing for believing the worst about him. It was a small comfort, but it was something. Yet, with every positive comment came the looming threat of Campbell's revenge. The man was still powerful, still dangerous, and Johnny knew that they weren't out of the woods yet. One evening, as Johnny was closing up the diner, Campbell had been too busy dealing with the fallout to even show up. Two men in suits walked in. They introduced themselves as investigators, sent to look into the allegations against Campbell. They questioned Johnny and Mary separately, asking them to recount everything they knew, everything they had done. The interrogation was grueling, but Johnny knew they had to be thorough. He answered their questions as best as he could, his mind racing the whole time. When they finally left, Johnny and Mary exchanged a glance, both exhausted and relieved. The investigation had officially begun, and now it was out of their hands. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The authorities began seizing records, questioning employees, and tracing the money trail that Campbell had so carefully hidden. It was clear that the net was closing in on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the town watched the investigation unfold, the support for Johnny and Mary grew. People began to rally around them, organizing community meetings, and even starting a fund to help cover any legal fees they might incur. The tide had turned, and for the first time in a long time, Johnny felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. But even as the walls closed in on Campbell, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He knew that a man like Campbell wouldn't go down without a fight, and the closer they got to justice, the more dangerous he would become. As the investigation into Mr. Campbell's dealings reached its peak, the once mighty businessman found himself increasingly cornered. The evidence was overwhelming, and the pressure from both the authorities and the public was more than he could manage. Rumors swirled through the town like wildfire, stories of bank accounts frozen, assets seized, and even whispers that Campbell might flee the country to escape the impending charges. Johnny kept his head down, continuing to work at the diner even as the walls around Campbell began to crumble. With the restaurant nearly empty most days, it was a stark reminder of how far the mighty had fallen. The man who once commanded fear and respect was now little more than a shadow, haunted by his own misdeeds. But even as Campbell's empire collapsed, Johnny knew they weren't out of danger yet. One evening, as he was closing up, Campbell appeared, looking disheveled and desperate. His once impeccable suit was wrinkled, and his eyes, once cold and calculating, now held a wild desperation. "You think you've won, Miller?" Campbell sneered, though his voice lacked the venom it once held. "You think you can just take everything from me?" Johnny stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "You did this to yourself, Campbell. It's over." But Campbell wasn't ready to admit defeat. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat. "I made this place. I made this town. Without me, you're nothing. None of you are." Johnny felt a pang of fear as Campbell stepped closer, but he didn't back down. "Maybe," Johnny said quietly, "but at least we'll be free." For a moment, it seemed like Campbell might lash out, but then the fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped, and he looked like a man who had aged 20 years in just a few days. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Johnny standing there, shaken but resolute. The next morning, news broke that Campbell had been arrested. The authorities had found more than enough evidence to charge him with fraud, money laundering, and a host of other crimes. The town buzzed with the news, and for the first time in weeks, Johnny felt a glimmer of hope. But the victory was bittersweet. The diner was closed temporarily while the investigation continued, and Johnny found himself without a job. The support from the community was strong, but it wouldn't pay the bills. As he sat at home with Sarah and Tommy, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. They had won the battle, but the war for their future was far from over. That evening, as Johnny sat at the kitchen table, going over the bills, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find several townspeople standing on his porch, including Mary. They looked serious, but there was a warmth in their eyes that took Johnny by surprise. "We've been talking," Mary said, stepping forward. "The diner's been a part of this town for years, and we can't let it die with Campbell. We want you to reopen it, Johnny. Run it the right way." Johnny stared at them, stunned. "Me? But I'm just a dishwasher." "You're more than that," one of the men said firmly. You stood up to him when no one else would. You've got what it takes to make this place better than it ever was." Johnny looked at the faces around him, seeing the sincerity in their eyes. They believed in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, he nodded, the enormity of what they were offering sinking in. I'll do it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll need all the help I can get." A chorus of agreement rose from the group, and for the first time in a long time, Johnny felt a spark of hope. The diner would reopen, not as Campbell's Diner, but as something new, something better. And he would make sure it was a place where no one had to struggle like he had. As the townspeople left, Johnny stood on the porch, looking out at the night sky. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a future worth fighting for. The reopening of the diner was a day the town wouldn't forget. The once faded sign now gleamed with fresh paint, proudly displaying its new name, Miller's Diner. Johnny stood at the entrance, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and nervousness as he watched the townspeople gather, eager to see the new chapter that was about to begin. The transformation inside was just as striking. Gone were the worn-out booths and dim lighting. In their place were bright, welcoming spaces, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and homemade meals. Johnny had insisted on affordable prices and a menu that catered to everyone, from the morning rush to the late-night stragglers. It was a place where the community could come together, where everyone was welcome. Sarah and Tommy buzzed around the diner, helping where they could. Sarah, now more confident and full of a new sense of purpose, took orders with a smile that made Johnny's heart swell with pride. Tommy, still the curious adventurer, found joy in refilling water glasses and delivering menus to the customers. They were more than just helpers. They were part of the heart and soul of this new venture. Mary was by Johnny's side, guiding him through the chaos of the opening day. Her presence was steadying, and together, they had formed a partnership that was built on trust, respect, and something deeper that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. As the day went on, Johnny realized that Mary had become more than just a friend. She had become part of his family. The diner thrived, the tables filled with familiar faces and new ones alike. People came not just for the food, but for the sense of community that Johnny had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just a business. It was a place where people could belong, where they could share their stories, and where they could find a little bit of hope in the everyday. As evening fell and the last customers trickled out, Johnny finally allowed himself to take a breath. He stood behind the counter, looking out at the diner, at everything they had accomplished. It wasn't just a victory over Mr. Campbell. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, who had ever been told they weren't enough. Mary came up beside him, a soft smile on her face. "We did it, Johnny," she said quietly, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it." Johnny shook his head, his voice filled with gratitude. "We did it, Mary. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching as Sarah and Tommy cleaned up the last of the tables. The future still held its uncertainties, but for the first time, Johnny felt ready to face whatever came next. He had his kids, his diner, and now, perhaps, the beginning of something new with Mary. Before leaving, Johnny took one last look around the diner, his heart full. "Let's go home," he said, his voice steady and filled with contentment. As they stepped out into the cool night, the sign above the door glowed warmly in the dark. Miller's Diner, a place for everyone. It was more than just a name. It was a promise, one that Johnny intended to keep. And with that, Johnny, Sarah, Tommy, and Mary walked home together, ready to embrace the new beginning they had fought so hard to create. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.